As we have the document, we would like to thank you for this summary. In your presentation, you mentioned very important points, such as the databases you're providing, the recommendations you have made at the political level, and most of all, you insisted on one point which seems absolutely crucial, the transformation or processing of our agricultural products. Africa has to stop exporting raw materials and these materials have to be processed locally to create added value and employment, which is very important for the future of Africa. So thank you very much. To save time, we'll listen to all panelists and then we'll give the floor to the audience to ask questions or ask for clarification. I now give the floor to Professor Alan Matthews, who is Professor of European Agricultural Policy in Ireland, and who will talk about the impact of the CAP and lesson learned for Africa's agricultural regional trade. Professor, you have the floor. I can also speak in English, but I would like to practice my French. Thank you very much.
You have the floor.
Thank you, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning. One of the questions that's often asked about European agricultural policy and integration is, are there lessons which we can learn from the European experience, which could be helpful to other regions, and in this case, obviously the Africa continental free trade area, in progressing their integration. So with the agreement of the organizers, I want to take you on a little bit of a historical tour and to try to highlight some of the important prerequisites which have led to what I think is one of the real success stories of European integration, which is the integrated agricultural market. Now, that's not to say that we didn't make mistakes along the way. I'm certainly going to highlight those. But I want also to emphasize some of the important steps which actually helped to bring this about. So let's go back to the immediate aftermath of the Second World War period. We had Europe, which of course had been heavily destroyed as part of the war. We had periods of really quite severe hunger in the immediate post-war period. And we also had a set of countries which had adopted highly self-sufficient policies, partly on balance of payments grounds. There simply was a big shortage of foreign exchange in Europe in those years, but which also had developed very different national agricultural policies. You had countries which had traditionally been free trade in their outlook, like the Netherlands, like Denmark, but you also had countries that were highly protectionist, like France, like Germany, the southern European countries. So you had a complex pattern of very different national policies at that time. These countries then, at least 6 of them initially, came together to establish a European common market, a European economic community as it was at that time. And this was founded on the Treaty of Rome in 1958. Which established the goal of a common market. So this involved a customs union, so more than a free trade area, a customs union, but also the free movement of goods, of services, of capital, of labor, and flanked by a number of common policies. Initially, important ones such as competition policy, policies on state aids, and of course, agriculture. This liberalization of agricultural trade between initially these 6 countries, now 28, perhaps 27 in a short period of time, took place in the context of a common agricultural policy. So there were a number of principles established at the outset, which are well known to students of this policy domain. Market unity, meaning that we did want to have an integrated market without barriers to trade. Community preference, which was defined at the time as giving priority to domestic agricultural production, so it was strongly self-sufficient at the outset. Imports were permitted, but only when domestic production was inadequate to meet domestic demand. And then financial solidarity, so there was a financing system in place to share the costs of implementing this common policy. The policy initiated with a regulation in 1962, which essentially created a common market organization for cereals. This was fundamental because once you had established the market for cereals, you effectively had set up, if you like, the framework for also competing products, arable crops like sugar and so on, but also for livestock products because cereals is an important input into these products. So this was a very fundamental step, and it led over a period of years, completed in 1968, to effectively a tariff-free trade zone with a common external tariff. Not just for cereals, but also for the other agricultural commodities at that time. As I say, the political problem was to try to bring about an agreement between these 6 countries which had very different national policies, very different support systems, and very different price levels. And one of the, in a sense, looking back, we might see it as a mistake, but perhaps a political necessity, was that in order to get the agreement, particularly of the German government at the time, the initial level of common prices established within this common agricultural policy was set at the higher end of the range of these 6 countries. So this is a table just to demonstrate that on average, probably the guaranteed prices for European farmers were about double world market prices. And indeed, for some commodities such as sugar, you can see that you have even differences of 3, 4, even up to 5 times. So this was the classical cap. And this diagram, probably familiar to most of you in the room, essentially shows how that common agricultural policy operated. So there were these guaranteed minimum prices for farmers, established, as I say, well above world market levels, and defended against cheaper imports by variable import levies at the time. And then as surpluses grew, these surpluses were disposed of with the aid of variable export refunds. And I suppose the history of the European Common Agricultural Policy over the following almost 50 years since 1968 has been to try to rectify, if you like, some of the problems that arose as a result of this classical cap, which clearly proved extremely expensive as surpluses grew within the European Union, and also, of course, led to huge trade distortions on world markets to the detriment of the European Union's trading partners. And I will say that what we have observed with the successive reforms in the CAP is that those guaranteed minimum prices have been, by and large now, reduced to somewhat below world market levels. They are at safety net levels. Of course, the significant protection, particularly for sensitive commodities, continues. There has been some reform of those import duties as a result of the WTO agricultural agreement, the Uruguay Round Agreement. And we have now abolished, of course, export refunds as a result of the Nairobi Accord in the WTO. So that's the traditional picture. It has now changed completely. But what I would argue is that this was not necessary to the idea of an integrated market. It was politically necessary because of the very significant differences between national price support policies at the outset, but it wasn't intrinsically a requirement of an integrated agricultural market. And my understanding would be that within Africa today, that the differences, yes, there are differences between external protection levels, but they are much smaller than what was the case at the outset of the CAP in the 1960s. Removing tariff barriers, of course, as many speakers have already mentioned, is just a preliminary step to an integrated market. And by 1988, we had become increasingly aware that we still had a fragmented food and agricultural market within the European Union. There was an important report, the Cecchini report in 1988, which identified just in 10 food sectors alone more than 200 non-tariff barriers. So how to address these? And the initial approach, particularly in the area of food safety, and standards, was to try to harmonize these standards. So the Commission would put forward a proposal as to what should be the technical standard or the level of food safety. It took an enormous amount of time to get it. I think the first agreement was on food flavorings, what would be allowed to be added to foodstuffs. And member states were still discussing this 10 years after the Commission had put forward the proposal. And of course, technology had moved on, and by the time the regulation was adopted, it had already become out of date. So this was simply not an efficient way of addressing the non-tariff barrier issue. So what was decided as part of what was called the Single European Act in 1992, which essentially created a single market, not only in agriculture, but particularly in food and agriculture, was a new approach to harmonization, which was founded on an important decision of the European Court of Justice on the Cassis de Dijon, which is a blackcurrant liquor. And essentially, Germany had a sort of spirits monopoly at the time, and it set minimum standards for the alcohol content of different drinks. And this particular blackcurrant liquor, Cassis de Dijon, had a lower alcohol content than what was permitted to be sold on the German market. And a case was taken, and the court decided that this was an illegal barrier to trade. That so long as this drink could legally be sold in one member state, it was produced in France, then it could not be prevented from being sold in other member states. And that led to two important elements of this so-called new approach to harmonization, to the removal of these non-tariff barriers. One was that there would be a minimum standard of harmonization. So the countries could, of course, adopt higher standards than the minimum. This was not prevented, but they could not keep products produced in other countries legally sold in those countries out of their own market. So a minimum level, but also a high level of health and food safety standards. But the other important element was that of mutual recognition. So essentially, member states undertook to accept that if a product was legally sold on the market of France, then it could be sold on their country market also, even if it didn't actually meet the standards that they might require of their own domestic producers. So an important principle which was only really adopted because at the same time we had a change in decision-making procedures which allowed these decisions to be taken by qualified majority vote. If we had had unanimity as the requirement, I doubt that we would have made the progress that was made. So what are the main lessons to summarize from this experience? Full trade integration, in other words, a sort of single market in food and agriculture, requires a high level of domestic policy integration. I think that's what we learned from the EU experience, which has to be backed up by trust. So we have to trust that other countries are indeed implementing the rules and that their products are indeed meeting the minimum European standards. And the importance of this issue of trust, I think, can be demonstrated in the discussions around Brexit and the potential sort of trade agreement that may follow from the withdrawal of the United Kingdom, where it's clear that there is a worry, a concern on the part of Europeans that the UK may use its exit to adopt a sort of what some call this Singapore on the Thames idea, that it will lower the regulatory standards in some areas, and that this would give it an unfair competitive advantage if it were at the same time offered a free trade agreement with the Union after Brexit occurs. So you can see that there's a close relationship, if you like, between a country's willingness to open its markets to trade with its neighbors and sort of trust in the level of domestic enforcement of food safety standards in particular. I think a second lesson from the European experience is that regional integration, it does set limits on the exercise of domestic agricultural policy. I think that's most clear in the case of market intervention measures. It's clear that if you, as country A, tries to maintain a higher support price for your farmers through some kind of intervention mechanism, for example, than country B, then you will simply, in a free trade agreement, you will simply attract imports from the lower priced country. It simply will overwhelm your capacity to deal with it. So you either have to limit your domestic policies to sort of budgetary type measures rather than market intervention, or as the European Union did, you have to move agricultural policy making to the higher level, to the union level, and have a common policy at that level. That's not proposed in the African context, so it does mean, I think, that there will be these increased disciplines on the way in which African countries can implement domestic agricultural policy in a free trade situation. And as I say, if you do have this supranational policy, as we have learned in the European Union, it does come with its own set of policy issues, which we are still struggling with. How do you have a common policy for an agriculture which is so different across a wide area such as the European Union? Farmers in Finland, farmers in Spain face very different conditions. How to have a single policy, and this is something we are currently trying to grapple with in the most recent reform which the Commission has proposed last year. There is in your pack a book chapter which tries to elaborate on some of these arguments, these lessons, if you like, which might be learned from the European experience in agricultural integration. Let me just add, and to bring the story up to date, I have argued that the classical CAP has been fundamentally reformed, that there has been a significant reduction, and it's not quite eliminated, but a significant reduction, particularly in the more trade distorting supports, although, of course, European farmers still get significant income support through so-called decoupled area-based payments. And I know in Africa there is a concern still that these supports to European farmers do distort trade and create difficulties for African producers. That's not the topic for today's discussion, but I simply wanted to draw your attention to a report which, in case you might find it of interest, which I recently wrote for the Committee of the Regions, which looks at this impact of the current CAP on agriculture in developing countries. And as it happens, most of the case studies are based on West Africa. So we looked particularly at three commodity chains, so milk powders, chicken meat, and tomato paste. And I suppose our conclusion was that, yes, there can be some evidence that the CAP, particularly in the milk powders case, has encouraged increased dairy production within the European Union. It's less evident, in fact, I would argue it's not really the case in the case of chicken meat and tomato paste. But whether this is really a fundamental issue for African countries, we had a question mark. Clearly, there are supply issues within African countries which need to be addressed. The potential trade effects of further reform of the CAP, which is indeed desirable, and we certainly are trying to use those subsidies to farmers in a more effective way. We're looking at trying to implement this green transition, not just in the energy sector, but also in the agricultural sector. And there is a greater need to use the support to European farmers in a much more effective way than we do at the present time. And that would certainly help, I think, to address some of the criticisms that are still being made of the CAP. But as I say, that's not really the issue that we are looking at today. I hope that that very quick history lesson does perhaps highlight some of the issues which may face the African countries as you proceed with this very ambitious plan for the Continental Free Trade Agreement. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Professor Matthews, thank you very much
Exposé, très brillant.
for your presentation. It was very good.
Il faut tirer la leçon et que il faut pas que
We have to conclude
nous
the
en
following.
Afrique, nous répétons
In
les
Africa,
erreurs
we don't
commises
have to make the same mistakes Europe
en
did
créant la zone de libre-échange.
with our
Vous
free
avez fait
trade
l'historique de la
area.
politique agricole commune, depuis la
You
création
talked about the history of the
du
CAP,
traité de Rome
the
jusqu'à maintenant.
Rome Treaty,
Vous avez
Treaty of
insisté
Rome,
sur
from
le fait qu'il est
back then to now,
très, très difficile
insisted on the fact that it's very difficult, and we see that
d'harmoniser les politiques agricoles
to
de
harmonize
chaque État,
agricultural policies of each state to create an ensemble. At the beginning, there were 6 countries, and now 27 with Brexit. After the Brexit, yeah, we will be in 27, and it is very complicated. In Africa, we have 55 states. How to harmonize the agricultural policies with a common goal, the African integration. Yeah, we have a lot of work to do in the African Union. You bring on the table a subject which is very important, the green transition in the agricultural sector. Yesterday on television, I saw that in Europe, farmers went to Brussels, to Paris, and Germany also, to demonstrate, to say that we ask too much from them. We want to tackle pesticides and everything, but this is too hard for them. But I want also to address the issue of the transition of actual agricultural technology to a technology that takes care of the environment. I will not comment that much on this issue, but thank you very much